This semester in EDCI 342, we focused our learning around the development of several core practices in the teaching of elementary language arts. Throughout this digital story, I will explain what they mean to me, my students, and to teaching language arts. The language arts encompass all of the language modes: reading, writing, speaking, and listening. The 7 core practices should be integrated into every lesson and can make the difference between a good teacher and a great teacher. The first teaching practice that we focused on was differentiation. Differentiation uses pre-assessment and formative assessment data to create developmentally appropriate instruction that takes into account individual learners' strengths, interests, and needs. Students are like fingerprints. No two are alike. This means that each and every student reads and writes at their own unique level. Differentiation means tailoring instruction to meet the individual needs of students. As teachers, it is important that we get to know each and every student and adapt our teaching in order to create the best learning experience possible and also to meet each child's needs. What does differentiation look like? This semester, I've been able to observe and implement lots of differentiation in my placement classroom. An example is when I plan my writing mini lesson. By evaluating my students' pre-writings, I was able to determine that some of my students needed more instruction and focus on persuasive writing, specifically using strong persuasive language. The assignment that my mentor teacher assigned for students was to write a persuasive robot ad persuading someone to buy a robot. Evaluating pre-writings enabled me to see that some of my students were using language to inform, not to persuade. I used my students' pre-writes to develop a mini lesson that focused on how to use strong persuasive writing to appeal to a specific audience. In the end, I was able to teach a mini lesson to a group of students that needed more specialized and individualized instruction. Another example of how I have used differentiation in my classroom is by having student interest surveys. The surveys allowed me to get to know each and every student by learning about their interests, families, culture, and even learning habits. Student surveys are beneficial because they allow us to plan and implement lessons that are relevant and interesting to our students. In the first blog, I mentioned how my students made me aware of their different learning styles. Some of my students enjoyed working in groups, while others preferred to work independently. This is very useful information that can be used while writing lesson plans. In my future classroom, I think it would be fun to let students pick book clubs based on interest. I could assign 4 books and allow students to choose which book they would like to read. That way, they enjoy the book and they will walk away having a better learning experience. The second core teaching practice is CRP, which means using culturally relevant teaching practices and materials. In order to be culturally relevant and reach students of all diversities, teachers must create a classroom that is both accommodating and inviting. Teachers must demonstrate that they care for their students and allow students to see themselves and others in the content that they are learning. Teachers can do this by including a wide range of cultures in their lessons, as well as ethnicities and races. In my writing mini lesson, I gathered all sorts of advertisements for my students to look at and analyze for strong persuasive language. Many of the advertisements that I chose to show my students were culturally relevant. 72% of the students in my classroom have Hispanic backgrounds. Takis are an extremely popular ethnic snack in my classroom and in Germantown. Because I knew how popular they are, I decided to find a Taki ad for my students because I knew it would be both culturally relevant and familiar to them. Many of my students became very excited when they saw the ad, and they were very interested in looking at it to find the persuasive language. By paying close attention to all of our students' backgrounds, we can ensure our students are making connections to our lessons. The third core teaching practice is language production, explicitly teaching academic language. Academic language is language that is used within the classroom. It is different in vocabulary and structure from everyday spoken English of social interactions. In my placement classroom, my students learn to use academic language very frequently. Academic language does not pertain to only the language arts, but rather all subject areas. My classroom has a math word wall that lists math vocabulary that pertains to the unit that the students are learning about. The math word wall acts as a daily reminder to students of specific mathematical terminology that should be used. In a math lesson that I taught, I made sure I reviewed and used specific math terminology. In my science lesson, I did the same. Words like hypothesis, data, and conclusion are all examples of academic language that my students are learning to use in their writing. When students learn new vocabulary words, they learn how to pronounce the word, they learn the word's meaning, but they also learn how to use the word in their own sentences. The fourth core teaching practice is scaffolding, appropriately sequencing learning activities to scaffold learning. Scaffolding is an instructional technique where the teacher models the desired learning strategy or task, then gradually shifts responsibility to the students. My mentor teacher commonly refers to this as the I do, we do, you do model. The gradual release of responsibility allows for the teacher to transition from assuming all of the responsibility for performing a task to a situation in which the students assume all the responsibility for completing the task. This semester, I taught a lesson on Greek and Latin roots using the gradual release of the responsibility model. The I do section is where I modeled how to underline root words and how to use prefixes and suffixes to determine the meanings of words. In the We Do section, students volunteered to demonstrate how to underline the roots of the words and separate the roots from their prefixes and suffixes. After students worked with me to underline roots, I released them into independent work where they needed to complete a worksheet on Greek and Latin root words. They learned a new skill, practiced it with classmates as well as myself, and then demonstrated that they understood the information by completing individual work. The fifth core teaching practice is oral language, creates meaningful and multiple oral language opportunities. Over the semester, our class talked about the importance of oral language opportunities several times. In my second blog post, I wrote about how my students have had a ton of oral language opportunities. One idea that I consider to be very important for my students is to have time to share ideas before engaging in the physical process of writing. When students talk to one another before they write, they are able to share ideas and verbalize what exactly they are trying to say. It allows students to think and talk about what they are going to write before they actually have to do so. Oral language opportunities allow students to verbalize their own thoughts and also receive feedback from their peers. The sixth core teaching practice that we focused on this semester was responsiveness. Monitors student learning and adjusts instruction to changing conditions. Classrooms are unpredictable, and teachers must be able to adapt to changing conditions and respond accordingly. Formative assessments allow teachers to gauge each student's level of understanding and then use that information to tweak or influence further instruction. For example, when I was teaching a social studies lesson, I was able to tell that my students were confused about information regarding the French and Indian War. For a pre-write, I asked students to write anything and everything they could remember about the French and Indian War. The pre-writings indicated that many of my students did not know anything about the war, and it also revealed some misconceptions or misunderstandings that I needed to address before diving deeper into my lesson. Sometimes the lessons that we plan on paper are perfect, but in reality we must be responsive to certain situations as they arise and take advantage of moments where students are confused or have not grasped a concept. The last, but not least, core teaching practice is reflection, using a variety of data to reflect, evaluate teaching and learning, and to adapt planning and practice. In my future classroom, I plan to use all of the teaching practices together so that I can provide the best learning experiences possible for my students. To start, my classroom will be a safe, fun, and inclusive environment for all students, and where all students are eager to learn. I am learning how to differentiate instruction so that each student receives what they need in order to succeed. In addition, I have learned the importance of writing conferences. Through class discussions and our textbook, I have learned how important writing conferences are. Writing conferences allow for individualized feedback and instruction based on what each student needs. Our textbook, called The Writing Workshop, states that conferences should not be lengthy, but must be instructional and have a purpose. The book also states that we should put the task of evaluating writing into the students' lap so that they can take ownership of their own work. By reading their own work, students can read aloud and hear what they need to improve on and make decisions on whether or not to change the work that they have already written. A major takeaway that I have is the importance of publishing written work. This semester, my students worked on 3 major writing assignments. All 3 assignments were published and put on display for the entire school as well as parents to see. Specifically, when my students finished writing their robot ads, they were able to display their ads and their robot models in the school cafeteria for students, staff, and parents to look at. We held a Robo Expo where classes around the school, parents, and the principal were invited to walk around the cafeteria and ask students about their robots. The students read their ads aloud and persuaded people to buy their robots. Students were able to showcase their work as well as engage in oral language opportunities by reading it aloud. The publishing allowed students to take great pride in their work, and I was so pleased with the final products. In order to become a better teacher, it is important to identify strengths and weaknesses. The core teaching practices can be used as a guide or a tool in order to improve our teaching. Teachers are learners, just like students. We are constantly learning how to improve our teaching so that it becomes more and more effective and in order to reach each and every student.